Welcome back, class. Let's go ahead and review the last session, session number 6. This is where we introduced chapter 12 on social psychology. We wanted to address such things as how we think and relate to other people, how other people influence not only our thinking but our actions, and how we treat each other and relate to each other. We also talked about attributions. Attributions is trying to identify the causes of things. Why is it that we see certain behaviors occur? What caused it? Attribution theory is where we try to explain others' behavior based on two types of attributions. We can attribute something to the situation or to their personal characteristics or disposition. We also talked about the fundamental attribution error, an error that we tend to make where we go too far in assuming that a person's behavior is caused by their personality. We also talked about attitudes, these feelings and ideas and beliefs that affect how we approach and react to other people, objects, and events. We then discussed how those attitudes can be changed by looking at the central route or peripheral route of persuasion. We then examined attitudes affecting our behavior or our actions. So the idea here is that yes, we can see under certain circumstances our attitudes are going to be influenced. Attitudes are going to influence our actual behavior and our actions. But at the same time, we need to understand this. Actions affect our attitudes as well. And that's where we left off last class, and we'll pick up on that now. We see this idea of our behavior influencing our attitudes by looking at three social cognitive mechanisms: the foot in the door phenomena and the effects of playing a role or role playing, and cognitive dissonance. So, in this example, we look at the idea of somebody getting someone to do a small favor so that they can do larger favors. In this particular slide, we see a political campaigner ask if you would open the door just enough to pass a clipboard through. Well, you agree to this. Then they ask you to sign a petition. You agree to that. Then they ask you to make a small contribution, and you agree to that. Well, what happened here is an example of what we refer to as the foot in the door phenomena. The tendency to be more likely to agree to a large request after agreeing to a small one. Well, what are the effects on attitudes? People adjust their attitudes along with their actions, liking the people they agreed to help and disliking the people they agreed to harm. There are a few examples that sort of highlight the applications of this foot in the door phenomena, or how these things can affect and influence our attitudes. Several decades ago, there was an heiress named Patty Hearst who was kidnapped by a group called the SLA. And then, after a while of her being kidnapped, she was then photographed participating in a robbery with her kidnappers. So her attitudes about her kidnappers, we would assume at one point being very negative and didn't want to have anything to do with them. But at another point, after time had elapsed, she began to like and to participate in their illegal activities. In a similar fashion, if you can go to a prison scenario, prisoners were harmed in certain types of situations, Abu Ghraib prison and during the Iraqi war many years ago. Well, the idea here, if prisoners were harmed, and you're one of these prison guards, for example, prisoners were harmed, attitudes about prisoners became more dehumanizing. You made them less human, allowing harm to escalate. So the idea here is that we agree to certain things, and then our attitudes may shift and change to some extent. Some of this can be a very powerful thing and influence our behavior greatly. The other aspect of social thinking is this notion of role playing. Role playing affects our attitude. So if you, as they say, get into character and pretend to be a certain type of individual, the idea behind this is that when does that role that you're playing cease to become a role and it becomes who you are? You start to buy into all of that. So let's read these couple of quotes here by Nathaniel Hawthorne. We have, "No man for any considerable period can wear one face to himself and another to the multitude, without finally getting bewildered as to which may be the true face." The basic idea is very simple there, is that we have a private face and then we have all these different types of public faces. And if they are different to each other, you can start to play this role. We don't know which one may actually be true. You also have this other famous Alcoholics Anonymous slogan, "Fake it till you make it," meaning that you can fake things, play a role or pretend to play a role, and then it can actually become true. That's the premise behind that. So when we play a role, even if we know it's just pretending, we eventually tend to adopt the attitudes that go with the role and become the role. In arranged marriages, people often come to have a deep love for the person that they marry. Actors say they lose themselves in their roles. If you're familiar with, his name was Heath Ledger. He played the Joker a few years back, and there have been some indications that he got too deeply into that role, and it caused him some issues later psychologically. So, one classic study that talked about role playing was done by Philip Zimbardo in the Stanford Prison Study. You may see an example of this in one of the videos that are associated with this particular chapter, this unit. Participants in this study, and what they did is they had college students, regular normal college students who had no real psychological issues. They were tested. They agreed to participate in an experiment for 2 weeks, I believe. And some of them were randomly assigned to either be prison guards or prisoners. And they would go through this process for entirely of 2 weeks. The guards got the chance to go home after their shift was over, but the prisoners had to remain there throughout the length of the study. They were randomly assigned to these groups, one prisoners or guards. And basically what happened is, the idea is that the guards had demeaning views of the prisoners. They became very harsh, very critical, very controlling, very sadistic. The prisoners had rebellious dislike for the guards. They acted out. They staged riots and things of this nature. It sort of got out of hand. Even Philip Zimbardo, the researcher of this particular study, he played a role too as prison warden, and he even lost himself in the role as warden. Long story short, they had to stop this experiment before it reached its conclusion because things got way out of hand. People were having psychological issues and breakdown because of the issues that we saw by playing this role so closely. So role playing does have a great deal of impact on us. We can start to become the role we're pretending to be. And that's one of the issues here. So role playing can start to change your attitude. So if you start acting like a certain type of individual, your attitudes may adjust and your belief system may adjust such that you now feel like that new person at one point was just a role that you were playing. This all leads to this other notion of cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is basically the statement that we tend to want to have balance in our ideas, between our ideas and between our attitudes and our actions. So let's look at Fiona here. Fiona is a college student, and she believes her tuition is too high. So if Fiona agrees to do some fundraising, as we see in the bottom part of this slide, Fiona is now doing some fundraising, probably making cold calls to alumnus and trying to get them to donate money. Well, her belief, her attitude about tuition being too high at school, and her behavior of trying to get school new money, they conflict with each other. And that conflict is what is cognitive dissonance. The awareness that attitude and behavior are inconsistent. We now have dissonance, disharmony in a sense. And the idea is, how do we resolve it? Well, in this slide here, you see what Fiona does. Maybe the school has a point. So she did not stop working at the fundraising office. What she did is she adjusted her attitude. Her attitude now that her school has a point about needing funds and needing the money is different from her original attitude. The tuition here is too high, suggesting that the school has plenty of money. So cognitive dissonance is a very powerful thing. And what we see with it is the following. When our actions are not in harmony with our attitudes, when our actions are not in harmony with our attitudes, cognitive dissonance theory is this: the observation that we tend to resolve this dissonance by changing our attitudes to fit our actions. So we change our attitudes to fit our actions. If we go back to the case of Fiona, let's say she's getting paid for this fundraising activities to call up people and get money for her school. Well, that's a reinforcer there. That's a reward. So there's a lot of powerful things that support her maintaining that behavior. So it's going to be easier for her to adjust her attitude as opposed to stopping and quitting that job. Going back to how this all started, the origin of cognitive dissonance theory was what Leon Festinger's study in 1957. Students were paid either a large or a small amount to express enjoyment of a boring activity. Then many of the students changed their attitudes about the activity, which amount shifted attitudes. Well, here you go. Getting paid more did not shift your attitude. The activity was still a very, very boring activity. Okay? But getting paid less did shift your attitude. So they would say something like this to themselves with their internal dialogue. Why would I say it was fun? Just for $1? Weird. Maybe it wasn't so bad now that I think of it. So the idea here, they didn't have a legitimate reason external to themselves to do this behavior. So when they got paid more, obviously they said what they said because they got paid for it. It was obvious. They didn't have to change their attitude. They know why they did it. But if the inducement was so little for them to say what they said, their attitude would shift a little bit to make it more aligned. I did this behavior, okay, I didn't really get paid that much for it, so maybe it really wasn't that bad of a thing for it to happen.